Picture this: a moonlit harbor, the scent of salt and spices thick in the air, where the most unlikely of partnerships were forged in whispers. Pirate queens, feared and revered in equal measure, didn't just command fleets of ruthless raiders. They sat across tables from silk-clad merchants, striking deals that would bend the world to their will. These weren't just fleeting bargains between outlaws and traders. They were calculated alliances, woven in secrecy, that redirected the flow of gold, shifted empires, and rewrote the rules of power itself. What if I told you that some of history's most pivotal moments weren't decided on battlefields, but in the backrooms of bustling ports, where pirate queens and merchant guilds played a high-stakes game of shadows? For centuries, the stories of these clandestine pacts were buried, erased by kings who feared their influence, or drowned out by tales of sword fights and buried treasure. But the truth is far more fascinating. Imagine a pirate queen, her ship laden with plunder, docking not to sell her spoils in some lawless den, but to negotiate with the very merchants whose goods she'd stolen. Why? Because both sides stood to gain more from collaboration than conflict. The guilds needed protection from rival traders and royal taxes. The pirates needed safe harbors, market access, and legitimacy. Together, they built networks so powerful that entire economies trembled at their whims. From the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, these alliances didn't just fuel piracy, they shaped the modern world. And that's where our journey begins. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 22 of these extraordinary partnerships, each one a masterclass in strategy, survival, and sheer audacity. You'll meet queens who traded cutlasses for contracts, merchant lords who gambled fortunes on the loyalty of outlaws, and the shadowy middlemen who made it all possible. These stories aren't just about gold or glory. They're about rewriting the rules when no one's looking. So, ready to step into the hidden corridors of history, where the ink of a secret agreement could be deadlier than any sword. Let's begin. To truly grasp the audacity of these pirate queens, we need to step into their world, a world where women weren't just breaking glass ceilings, they were shattering entire galleons with their ambition. Take Grace O'Malley, the legendary Sea Queen of Connacht, who inherited her father's fleet as a teenager and turned it into a maritime empire. While most women of 16th century Ireland were confined to domestic roles, O'Malley was negotiating directly with Queen Elizabeth I, demanding the release of her captured son and securing royal recognition for her trade routes. Then there's Ching, the Cantonese pirate who transformed a ragtag fleet into a disciplined armada of over 1,000 ships, enforcing a strict code of conduct that even taxed fishermen for safe passage. These weren't just women who happened to be pirates, they were visionary leaders who understood that real power came from controlling systems, not just swords. What set them apart was their knack for playing both sides of the law. While male pirates often relied on brute force, these queens wielded diplomacy like a cutlass. Grace O'Malley didn't just raid English ships, she leased her own vessels to merchants as armed escorts, turning rivals into clients. Ching didn't merely plunder coastal towns, she established protection rackets with local officials, ensuring her operations ran smoothly under the guise of tax collection. Their genius lay in recognizing that piracy wasn't just about taking, it was about leverage. By the time merchant guilds sought them out, these women had already built networks so vast that kings and governors had no choice but to negotiate. But their rise wasn't just about strategy, it was about survival in a world stacked against them. In an era when women were denied property rights and political voice, pirate queens carved their own kingdoms at sea, where skill mattered more than gender. They surrounded themselves with loyal crews who respected their authority, often promoting merit over tradition. When Grace O'Malley's own clansmen questioned her leadership, she reportedly silenced them by giving birth to her youngest son mid-voyage, then rallying her crew to battle within hours. Ching, once a former prostitute, rewrote her destiny by outmaneuvering every rival, even pardoning enemies to absorb their fleets into her own. Their stories reveal a truth often left out of history books. Piracy wasn't just a rebellion against law, it was a rebellion against the very limits imposed on their lives. And that's what made their alliances with merchant guilds so revolutionary. These women didn't just want gold, they wanted legitimacy, stability, and a seat at the table. When a pirate queen and a guild master shook hands, it wasn't a pact between predator and prey, it was a merger of equals. The guilds gained protection from competitors and corrupt officials, while the queens gained access to ports, markets, and even legal cover for their operations. In a world where power was supposed to flow from crowns and courts, these women proved it could be seized with a mix of cunning, courage, and the occasional carefully timed betrayal. Merchant guilds weren't just traders, they were the invisible architects of the medieval economy, wielding power that rivaled kings. Imagine a web of interconnected families and factions, controlling everything from the price of saffron in Venice to the flow of silk along the Silk Road. These weren't mere shopkeepers, they were oligarchs in fur-lined robes, operating private armies, bribing officials, and even funding wars to protect their interests. But for all their influence, guilds faced two relentless threats: rival traders undercutting their monopolies, and royal treasuries demanding exorbitant taxes. That's where pirate queens came in, not as enemies, but as the ultimate loophole. Take the Hanseatic League, a colossal network of guilds that dominated northern Europe. Their ships carried timber, furs, and amber across stormy seas, but rival merchants and opportunistic nobles constantly raided their cargo. So they cut a deal with the Baltic's most feared pirates, safe passage for their fleets, in exchange for a cut of the profits and access to fortified ports. Suddenly, those pirates weren't just raiders, they were enforcers, sinking competitors' ships while Hanseatic merchants looked the other way. It was a win-win. The guilds got cheaper protection than hiring mercenaries, and the pirates gained something even more valuable: a veneer of respectability. But the real genius of these alliances lay in their flexibility. Merchant guilds were masters of plausible deniability. When a pirate queen like Jean de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany, burned English ships in the 14th century, French wool guilds quietly supplied her with intelligence on cargo routes. Officially, they condemned her raids. Privately, they profited as she crippled their English rivals. This dance of public condemnation and private collaboration let guilds maintain their reputations while reaping the rewards of chaos. And then there were the ports. Places like Tortuga or Port Royal weren't just pirate dens. They were carefully managed hubs of commerce where guilds laundered stolen goods into legitimate trade. A Spanish galleon's stolen silver might vanish into the holds of a Dutch merchant ship by dawn, its origins erased by a flurry of forged bills of sale. Guild accountants, with their ledgers and legal loopholes, were just as vital to these operations as the pirates who seized the loot. Together, they created a shadow economy that bypassed royal taxes and trade restrictions, funneling wealth directly into guild coffers. What's astonishing is how these partnerships reshaped entire regions. In the Indian Ocean, the merchant guilds of Calicut allied with the pirate queen Unnyarcha, using her fleet to monopolize the spice trade. When Portuguese explorers arrived, demanding control of the routes, it wasn't just Unnyarcha's warriors who fought back. It was the guild-funded militias armed with her stolen cannons. For centuries, history framed these conflicts as battles between empires and outlaws. In truth, they were corporate wars, with pirate queens as the guild's most ruthless CEOs. So why risk it all? Because the rewards outweighed the dangers. A guild that partnered with pirates could dominate markets without the cost of maintaining a navy or the scrutiny of royal courts. And for the pirate queens, these deals were a ticket out of infamy. Grace O'Malley's alliance with Irish wool guilds didn't just make her rich, it earned her a pardon from the English crown. Ching's negotiated surrender to the Qing dynasty included official titles for her lieutenants, transforming former outlaws into government-sanctioned privateers. The lesson was clear. In the game of global trade, sometimes the most powerful piece on the board wasn't a king or a queen. It was a well-timed handshake between those who ruled the waves and those who controlled the gold. Grace O'Malley's alliance with the Galway merchants wasn't just a handshake deal, it was a masterstroke of political theater. Picture the scene: Galway, a bustling port city where Spanish silks mingled with Irish wool, its merchant guild sweating under the weight of English taxes and rival clans' raids. Enter Grace, her ships bristling with cannons, offering a solution as bold as it was simple. She wouldn't just stop raiding their vessels, she'd protect them from everyone else. In return, the guild fed her intelligence ship manifests, trade routes, even whispers of English troop movements, all slipped to her through back channels while public denials kept their hands clean. What made this pact revolutionary was its sheer audacity. The Galway merchants were no back-alley smugglers. They were the economic backbone of Western Ireland, with ties to courts in London and Madrid. By aligning with Grace, they weren't just hiring muscle, they were outsourcing their security to a woman the English called a nurse to all rebellions. And Grace, she gained something far more valuable than plunder: legitimacy. With guild-supplied provisions, her fleet could strike farther and linger longer, while her protected merchants spread word of her fairness, turning her from a feared raider into a necessary evil. But the real brilliance lay in the details. The guild didn't pay Grace in gold, they paid in opportunity. When their ships sailed unharmed, competitors assumed they'd bribed her, which only drove more merchants into the guild's fold, desperate for the same protection. Meanwhile, Grace used guild intelligence to target rivals' cargoes with surgical precision, weakening enemies while her allies' profits soared. It was a feedback loop of power. The richer Galway grew, the stronger Grace became, and the more the English crown seethed. And then came the ultimate test, when English forces blockaded Galway in 1586, starving the city into submission. Grace didn't abandon her partners. She smuggled grain past the blockade, turning the guild's warehouses into lifelines and proving that her word meant more than any royal decree. Years later, when she famously sailed up the Thames to negotiate with Elizabeth I, it wasn't just as a pirate queen. She arrived as the de facto representative of Irish trade interests, her credibility cemented by decades of guild-backed influence. This wasn't mere symbiosis, it was a blueprint. Grace and the Galway merchants showed how piracy and commerce could twist the rules until they snapped. Where others saw lawlessness, they saw leverage, a way to bend an unjust system to their will. And in the end, their alliance didn't just rewrite Grace's story. It rewrote the map of power in Ireland, proving that sometimes the mightiest weapon wasn't a cannon, but a carefully kept secret between outlaws and the men who counted their gold. Ching's reign over the South China Sea wasn't built on fear alone. It was forged in the backrooms of Canton's merchant halls, where ink and intimidation held equal weight. By the time she commanded over 1,000 ships, the Qing dynasty had labeled her public enemy #1. Yet instead of crushing her, they found themselves bargaining with her. Why? Because Shee had done the unthinkable. she'd turned piracy into a regulated industry, and the Canton Syndicate, the powerful coalition of tea, silk, and porcelain traders, became her silent partners in crime. At first glance, their alliance defied logic. These were the same merchants whose cargoes Ching's pirates had plundered for years, but desperation breeds strange bedfellows. The syndicate was choking under imperial taxes and British East India Company aggression, while Ching's fleet, though formidable, lacked the legitimacy to dock in major ports without risk. So they struck a deal straight out of a mobster's playbook: protection in exchange for profit sharing. Merchants received licensed flags, a guarantee their ships would sail unharmed, while Ching's enforcers patrolled the waters, sinking unlicensed competitors. It wasn't piracy anymore, it was a toll system with the syndicate acting as her accountants, laundering plundered goods back into the legal trade. The sheer scale of their operation would make modern cartels blush. Ching's code of conduct, 70 articles long, dictated everything from profit splits to prisoner treatment. Guild representatives sat in on her tribunals, ensuring fines for unauthorized raids on their allies. Meanwhile, her pirates became the syndicate's unofficial customs force, intercepting smugglers who dared bypass Canton's tariffs. The Qing dynasty, already stretched thin by rebellions, found itself outmaneuvered. Crack down on Ching's and they destabilized the region's economy. Ignore her and she kept growing stronger. What made this partnership unstoppable was its mutual escalation. When the British tried to muscle in on Canton's trade, the syndicate didn't turn to the emperor, they turned to Ching's. Her fleet harassed British ships, forcing them to pay higher premiums for insurance, while syndicate brokers undercut their prices. By the time the king finally offered her a pardon in 1810, it wasn't out of victory, it was exhaustion. Ching's retired not as a defeated outlaw, but as a wealthy businesswoman, her former lieutenants absorbed into the Qing Navy as advisors to the very merchants they'd once terrorized. This wasn't just a pirate's retirement, it was a corporate merger. The syndicate kept its monopoly, Ching's kept her fortune, and the king saved face by pretending they'd tamed her. But the real legacy, proof that even the mightiest empire could be outplayed by a pirate queen who understood the golden rule. Terror opens doors, but contracts build kingdoms. Jean de Clisson's story begins not with a cutlass in hand, but with a noose around her husband's neck. When the French crown falsely accused Olivier de Clisson of treason and executed him in 1343, they expected his widow to fade into obscurity. Instead, Jean sold her estates, bought 3 warships and painted them black, a floating funeral cortege for the man she'd loved. But here's where history gets interesting. Her legendary 13-year reign of terror against French ships wasn't just fueled by vengeance. It was bankrolled by an unlikely network of Bretton Wool traders who saw in Jean not just a weapon but a business opportunity. These merchants had a problem. The 100 Years' War had turned the English Channel into a battleground, with both French and English crowns seizing Bretton Wool shipments to fund their armies. Enter Jean, whose black-sailed fleet became their shadow navy. In secret meetings at ports like St. Malo, they struck a deal. They'd provide her with gold, supplies, and most crucially, intelligence on French naval movements. In return, she'd spare their ships while ruthlessly targeting their competitors, ensuring Bretton Wool dominated the trade routes. It was piracy as corporate strategy, with Jean as their privateer-in-chief. The brilliance of their arrangement lay in its deniability. Officially, Breton merchants condemned Jean's raids, even petitioning the crown for protection. Privately, they funneled her information through coded messages hidden in wool bales, tipping her off to valuable French cargoes. When she captured a ship laden with Flemish textiles, a rival to Bretton Wool, she didn't just burn it. She delivered the goods to her merchant backers, who quietly sold them in neutral markets under forged labels. The French crown, already stretched thin by war, never suspected their economic bleeding was orchestrated by their own subjects. But Jean wasn't just a hired blade. She dictated terms, demanding the traders fund her most audacious stunt, blockading the Seine estuary for 6 months, starving Paris of supplies while Breton wool flowed freely elsewhere. Her revenge and their profits became inseparable. Each French ship she sank strengthened their monopoly. Each port she terrorized drove up demand for safe Breton goods. By the time the crown offered her amnesty in 1356, the wool traders had reshaped the region's economy, and Jean had cemented her legend. What makes this alliance extraordinary isn't just its success, but its legacy. Jean retired to England, her vengeance spent, but the Breton wool syndicate kept her playbook. They'd learned that sometimes the most effective trade barrier wasn't a tariff. It was a pirate queen with a grudge and a fleet painted the color of mourning. Sayida Al-Hara didn't just rule the waves. She rewrote the rules of Mediterranean trade with the precision of a chess grandmaster. While most pirate queens focused on plunder, this Moroccan sovereign turned the Strait of Gibraltar into her personal toll booth, courtesy of an audacious partnership with the silk guilds of Granada. Here's how it worked. The guilds, desperate to bypass Venetian middlemen and Spanish tariffs, needed a way to smuggle their luxury fabrics into Europe undetected. Sayida, with her fleet of swift corsair ships, offered an irresistible solution. She wouldn't just let their cargo pass unharmed, she'd escort it, sinking any competitors bold enough to challenge their monopoly. The genius of their arrangement lay in its layers of deception. Officially, Granada's silk merchants denounced piracy, even as their finest bolts of fabric slipped into European markets aboard Sayida's vessels, disguised as humble cargo. Dockmasters from Tangier to Marseille knew better than to ask why olive oil shipments arrived with armed escorts, or why certain warehouses never seemed to suffer raids. Meanwhile, Sayida's spies, many of them guild-affiliated brokers, fed her intelligence on Spanish naval patrols, ensuring her convoys always sailed one step ahead of the law. But this wasn't just about avoiding taxes. Together, they manipulated the market itself by selectively targeting rival silk shipments from Italy and the Ottoman Empire. Sayida artificially inflated demand for Granada's goods. A single well-timed raid near Sicily could send prices in Genoa soaring by dawn, with Granada's merchants ready to rescue desperate buyers with sudden, mysterious surpluses. The guilds even funded Sayida's most daring stunt, blockading Valencia for 3 months in 1522, not to pillage, but to strangle the city's silk trade until its merchants agreed to exclusive contracts. What set Sayida apart was her political savvy. While other pirates reveled in infamy, she cultivated an aura of regal legitimacy, hosting Granada's guildmasters in her palace at Tetuan as equals. When the Spanish labeled her a terrorist, the guilds countered with carefully crafted propaganda, painting her as a defender of Moorish commerce against Christian oppression. By the time Portugal tried to broker a truce with her in 1542, they weren't negotiating with a pirate, they were treating with a head of state, her power buoyed by silk profits and guild-funded diplomacy. The real testament to this alliance, its endurance. Long after Sayida's reign ended, the Granada silk guilds retained their dominance, their ledgers filled with discreet entries marking payments to marine logistics consultants. And the Strait of Gibraltar, it remained a bottleneck controlled not by empires, but by the shadowy understanding that commerce, when partnered with calculated piracy, could outmaneuver even the mightiest crowns. Centuries before medieval pirate queens carved their names into history, Queen Tutor of Illyria was already mastering the art of shadowy commerce. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, her rocky Adriatic kingdom sat at the crossroads of empires where Greek traders, Roman legions, and rival Illyrian clans all vied for control. But Tutor had a vision, one that didn't involve bowing to any of them. Instead, she turned her navy of swift Lem-by ships into both a weapon and a bargaining chip, striking a deal that would make Roman grain merchants her silent partners in empire building. Here's how it worked. Rome, still a rising power, desperately needed secure grain shipments from Sicily and Egypt to feed its swelling population. But rival Greek city-states and Carthaginian privateers lurked along the Adriatic routes, ready to pounce on vulnerable cargo ships. Tutor offered the Roman merchants an irresistible proposition: pay her a modest toll, and her fleet would guarantee safe passage through Illyrian waters. Refuse, and their ships vanished without a trace. To sweeten the deal, she even provided escort services, her pirates, now acting as mercenaries, patrolling the sea lanes to sink any unauthorized competitors. The brilliance of this arrangement was its dual edge. While Roman merchants celebrated fewer losses, they didn't realize Tutor was playing a deeper game. Every rival merchant ship she sank tightened Rome's dependence on her network, effectively giving her a stranglehold over their supply lines. Meanwhile, the tolls she collected weren't just filling Illyria's coffers. They funded her expansion, allowing her to fortify ports and bribe neighboring tribes into alliances. By the time Rome noticed their grain shipments were propping up a rival kingdom, Tutor had already turned the Adriatic into her personal fiefdom, but the real masterstroke. Tutor's manipulation of Roman politics. When conservative senators demanded a crackdown on Illyrian piracy, the grain merchants, now reliant on her protection, lobbied fiercely against it. They argued that Tutor's toll system was cheaper than maintaining a Roman navy in the Adriatic, and far more effective than dealing with unpredictable Greek pirates. For years, this economic pragmatism shielded her from retaliation, until one fatal miscalculation. Her captains overreached, seizing a shipment belonging to a senator's relative. The resulting war would end her reign, but not before exposing a truth that medieval pirate queens would later exploit: that even the mightiest empires could be held hostage by those who controlled the flow of trade. Tutor's story isn't just a footnote in ancient history, it's the prototype for everything that followed. She proved that piracy wasn't merely about plunder, it was about leverage, about turning the gears of commerce to one's advantage. When medieval merchant guilds later struck deals with pirate queens, they were walking a path she had carved centuries earlier, one where the line between outlaw and entrepreneur blurred into irrelevance. The Adriatic's waters may have forgotten her name, but the strategy she pioneered, the alliance of the desperate and the ambitious, would echo through the ages, a lesson written not in ink but in salt and gold. Lady Mary Killigrew's parlour in Arwenack House looked every inch the respectable Tudor manor tapestried walls, imported Venetian glass, and a steady stream of well-dressed guests. But behind the genteel facade, the widow of Cornwall's High Sheriff ran one of England's most sophisticated pirate operations with an unlikely partner, the Worshipful Company of Fishmongers, one of London's oldest and most powerful guilds. On paper, their alliance made no sense. Why would wealthy merchants dealing in herring and cod risk their necks for a pirate? Because Killigrew offered something no legitimate business could: a backdoor into Europe's richest markets, free from the Queen's grasping tax collectors. Here's how the scheme worked. Spanish and French merchant ships laden with wine, silks, and silver would vanish off the Cornish coast, plundered by Killigrew's fleet, which included former Royal Navy captains. But instead of selling the loot in shadowy ports, her fishmonger partners would discover barrels of lost cargo floating near their fishing grounds, then legally claim salvage rights. Overnight, stolen border wine became recovered goods, dutifully reported to customs with only a modest fee paid to the crown, rather than the full tariff. The fishmonger's impeccable reputation shielded the operation. After all, who would suspect London's pillar of the community guilds of fencing pirate loot? The brilliance of their system lay in its compartmentalization. Killigrew never set foot in London, maintaining plausible deniability. Her contacts communicated through coded messages hidden in fish deliveries. A scrawled mark on a barrel of salted cod might indicate which Breton merchant's ship to target next. Meanwhile, the guild's network of warehouses and carts provided perfect cover for moving goods inland. When authorities grew suspicious, the fishmongers played innocent, even petitioning Parliament for stronger anti-piracy laws, all while their ledgers showed a sudden, suspicious boom in salvage profits. But Killigrew's real power came from her social armor. As a highborn widow with connections at court, she hosted visiting dignitaries while her ships raided their homelands. When Spanish ambassadors complained of English piracy, she'd sigh over dinner about the unruly Cornish fishermen beyond her control. Even Queen Elizabeth's spies missed the truth for years, distracted by Killigrew's carefully cultivated image as a pious patron of Falmouth's poor. Never mind that the alms she distributed often came from plundered Spanish charity funds. The partnership's downfall came not from greed but overreach. In 1576, Killigrew's crew made the mistake of seizing a German merchant ship within sight of Penzance's harbor. Witnesses reported seeing her personally directing the raid from shore, her lace cuffs flashing in the torchlight. Arrested and sentenced to hang, she was pardoned at the last moment, not out of mercy, but because the Fishmongers' Guild quietly paid off her fines, fearing what she might reveal under torture. What makes this alliance extraordinary isn't its audacity, but its banality. For decades, London's fish markets doubled as black market clearinghouses, with guild members becoming adept at spotting which water-damaged crates of linen were too neatly packed to be accidental. Killigrew's story exposes the dirty secret of Elizabethan England's golden age. Piracy wasn't just tolerated by the establishment, it was the establishment, with respectable merchants and noble women alike dipping their hands in the till whenever the crown looked away. Elfhild the Shield Maiden's saga begins with a twist. Her father, a Viking chieftain, locked her in a tower guarded by serpents to deter suitors, but legends aren't made by staying put. She escaped, traded her gown for chainmail, and became one of the most feared raiders in the Baltic. Yet her true genius wasn't in swinging an axe, it was in recognizing that amber, the gold of the north, could buy more power than plunder alone. Along the fog-drenched coasts of Scandinavia, where pine forests bled into icy seas, Alfhild struck a deal with the very guilds whose ships she'd once terrorized. They needed protection from rival traders and Danish tax collectors. She needed a steady flow of wealth that didn't depend on seasonal raids. Together, they turned the Baltic into a private trading empire. What made this partnership revolutionary was its simplicity. The Amber Guilds, weary of losing cargo to Elfhild's fleet, offered her a cut of their profits in exchange for safe passage and the elimination of their competitors. Suddenly, her longships weren't just raiders, they were enforcers, sinking any vessel that dared bypass the guild's monopoly. In return, Alfhild gained something no amount of pillaging could secure: legitimacy. Guild merchants vouched for her at trading posts from Birka to Novgorod, introducing her as a business partner rather than an outlaw. Her crews, once pariahs, now docked openly in bustling ports, their holds filled with amber, furs, and Frankish swords, all acquired through negotiation rather than bloodshed. But Alfhild's brilliance lay in her adaptability. When Christian missionaries began encroaching on pagan trade routes, she didn't resist, she leveraged them. Amber, prized for rosaries and reliquaries, became her bargaining chip. Guild records suggest she even financed a church in Hedeby, ensuring priests turned a blind eye to her crew's less than holy activities. Meanwhile, her spies, many of them guild apprentices, fed her intelligence on Danish tax ships, allowing her to intercept them before they reached amber-rich shores. By the time King Harold Bluetooth claimed dominion over the Baltic, Alfhild's network was so entrenched that even he couldn't unravel it without collapsing the region's economy. The legacy of this alliance outlasted her. Centuries later, Hanseatic merchants would adopt her playbook, using privateers to enforce their monopolies. But Alfhild's story stands apart because she wasn't just a weapon for hire, she was a co-architect of the system. When she finally retired, legend says she left her fleet to a daughter raised among guild halls, not shield walls. It's a fitting end for a woman who proved that in the frozen north, commerce and conquest weren't opposites, they were the twin blades of a single strategy. Jacques de la Haye's fiery reputation as the red-haired terror of the Caribbean might paint her as a lone wolf, but her real power came from an alliance as sweet as the cargo she smuggled, the sugar barons of Hispaniola. While Spanish galleons chased phantom pirates on the horizon, de la Haye was cutting deals in mahogany-paneled plantation offices, where men in powdered wigs handed her manifests instead of muskets. These weren't just reluctant victims paying for protection. They were willing partners in a scheme that turned the Caribbean into a laundromat for stolen goods. Here's how the game worked. Sugar plantations, the crown jewels of colonial wealth, faced a brutal paradox. Their fortunes depended on exports, but Spain's mercantilist laws forced them to sell only to Spanish merchants at fixed, exploitative prices. Enter de la Haye and her fleet of nimble sloops. Plantation owners would lose barrels of sugar in staged pirate raids, complete with theatrical cannon smoke and splintered crates only for the stolen goods to reappear in Dutch or English ports, sold at triple the price. De la Haye took her cut. The planters pocketed untaxed profits, and Spanish officials were left chasing shadows. But the real stroke of genius, de la Haye's network of informants. Enslaved workers on plantations, often overlooked by colonial authorities, became her eyes and ears. A whispered tip about an incoming Spanish inspection could mean the difference between a convincing raid and a hanging. In return, de la Haye didn't just pay them in coin. She funneled escapees to maroon colonies, turning her criminal enterprise into an underground railroad for the desperate. This dual role, predator to the Spanish, liberator to the oppressed, made her a folk hero among the enslaved, ensuring her intelligence network remained unmatched. The sugar barons' complicity went deeper than smuggling. They financed de la Haye's raids on rival plantations, thinning competition while maintaining plausible deniability. When a French competitor's warehouse mysteriously burned hours before a shipment deadline, or a Dutch trader's ship found itself stranded on a reef only de la Haye's pilots could navigate, few asked why her fleet always profited from others' misfortunes. By the 1650s, she'd essentially become the region's shadow portmaster, deciding which crops reached Europe and which vanished into the black market. What makes this alliance so revealing is how it exposes the rot beneath the gilded surface of colonial wealth. The same planters who lectured about law and order in Sunday sermons were bankrolling piracy to bypass their own king's taxes. De la Haye, for her part, played both sides brilliantly, publicly vilified as a monster, privately toasted as a savior in the plantation houses where crystal glasses clinked over smuggled Madeira wine. Her legend might be wrapped in tales of buried treasure and naval battles, but her true legacy was proving that in the Caribbean, the line between respectable wealth and outright theft was as thin as the edge of a sugar cane leaf. Anne de Lavutte's name alone was a warning translated as "Anne God wants it," a nod to her uncanny survival against all odds. In the cutthroat world of 17th century Caribbean piracy, where men dominated both the decks and the history books, Anne didn't just survive, she thrived, thanks to an alliance so audacious it made governors blush. While most pirates dodged naval patrols, Anne worked alongside them, partnering with French privateer syndicates who operated under the thin veneer of legality. Their arrangement was simple. When France needed Spanish gold but didn't want the diplomatic scandal of outright war, they looked the other way as Anne's fleet unofficially harassed Spanish ships. In return, she shared the spoils with merchant backers in Port-de-Paix, who laundered her plunder through legitimate trade networks. What made this partnership extraordinary wasn't just its profitability, it was its brazen hypocrisy. French colonial officials publicly condemned piracy while quietly supplying Anne with intelligence, safe harbor, and even letters of marque when convenient. One surviving ledger from a Martinique sugar factor shows payments to ADV, listed discreetly between shipments of molasses and slaves, proof that everyone from plantation owners to naval officers had a stake in her success. Anne's genius lay in her ability to play both sides of the law. When Spanish authorities demanded her arrest, French governors would theatrically order sweeps of Tortuga's taverns, conveniently missing the house where Anne sipped wine with their own tax collectors. But the real twist, Anne's rise was fueled by personal vengeance as much as profit. After her first husband, a pirate, was killed by a Spanish naval officer, she didn't just mourn, she married his killer in a twisted act of psychological warfare. The officer, Laurens de Groff, had expected to silence a widow. Instead, he found himself outmaneuvered by a woman who turned their marriage into a business partnership, merging his fleet with hers and leveraging his connections to deepen her ties with the French elite. Together, they became the Caribbean's ultimate power couple, their raids so meticulously timed that Spanish merchants began calling hurricanes La Volonté d'Anne, Anne's will. The French crown's willingness to tolerate, even encourage, Anne's piracy reveals a darker truth about colonial economics. Legal trade was stifled by mercantilist restrictions, leaving profit-hungry officials no choice but to collude with outlaws. When Anne's ships captured a Spanish galleon laden with silver, French merchants didn't ask for receipts, they asked for discounts. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The golden age of piracy wasn't a rebellion against order. It was order, just with a wink and a loaded pistol under the table. Charlotte de Berry's legend reads like a paradox, a woman who reportedly disguised herself as a man to escape oppression, only to become enmeshed in one of history's most oppressive systems. While most pirate queens preyed on merchant ships, Charlotte's fleet struck a far darker bargain with the very traders who trafficked human lives across the Atlantic. This wasn't just piracy, it was a chilling collaboration that reveals how the golden age of piracy wasn't always a rebellion against tyranny, sometimes it was complicity. The mechanics of her alliance were as ruthless as they were pragmatic. Slave ships packed with captives and guarded by minimal crews made tempting targets. But instead of liberating the enslaved, Charlotte's crew saw opportunity. They'd intercept the vessels, murder the European slavers, then rebrand the human cargo as their own, capture, selling them anew in ports where no one asked questions. Slave traders, meanwhile, turned a blind eye to her raids on their competitors. After all, fewer ships meant higher prices for their own surviving cargo. It was a cycle of violence where the only constant losers were the men, women, and children trapped between pirates and profiteers. What makes this partnership so unsettling is how it weaponized the chaos of the transatlantic trade. Charlotte's reputation as a liberator among some crews she was said to recruit escaped slaves into her ranks, masked a grimmer truth. Survivors' accounts describe her offering captured slavers a choice: join her crew or be marooned. Those who signed on became accomplices in the very system they'd fled, attacking rival ships to sustain the trade that had once enslaved them. The moral lines blurred until piracy and slavery became two sides of the same blood-stained coin. Yet even within this darkness, glimmers of resistance flickered. Fragmentary records suggest Charlotte's fleet occasionally diverted ships to maroon colonies like the Bahamas, where escaped slaves could vanish into free communities. Was this redemption, or just another calculation strengthening her network of informants among the enslaved? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, a reminder that even the most compromised figures could occasionally bend the system they exploited. Charlotte's story forces us to confront piracy's ugliest contradictions. While some pirate queens used their power to challenge oppressive systems, others, like Charlotte, proved that outlaw status didn't always mean moral clarity. Her legacy isn't one of heroism or villainy, but of something far more uncomfortable, proof that when survival is the game, even the hunted can become the hunters. Rachel Wall's story begins not with a cutlass, but with a fishing net. In the harsh winters of post-revolutionary New England, where the sea froze solid in harbors and hunger gnawed at coastal villages, Boston's cod fishermen faced an impossible choice: starve or cheat. Enter Rachel, a fisherman's wife turned pirate, who turned their desperation into a lucrative and deadly partnership. On the surface, she played the grieving widow, her small schooner drifting innocently near shipping lanes with sails tattered as if from a storm. But when merchant ships drew near to offer aid, Rachel's crew sprang into action, murdering the Good Samaritans and claiming their cargo as salvage under maritime law. The twist: Boston's fishing guilds provided the perfect cover, their warehouses serving as black market hubs where stolen sugar and silk vanished into the legal trade. What made this alliance so brazen was its exploitation of colonial America's economic fragility. The fishing industry, once buoyed by British markets, collapsed after the Revolution, leaving guilds drowning in debt. Rachel offered a solution. Her raids targeted the very merchants who undercut local fishermen, while guild officials turned a blind eye for a percentage. Court records later revealed how stolen molasses barrels would reappear at guild auctions with freshly forged provenance papers, their origins laundered through layers of resale. Even Boston's port inspectors, many of them guild members themselves, mysteriously failed to notice when storm-damaged cargo matched missing shipments reported in New York. But Rachel's true innovation was her manipulation of gender norms. While male pirates relied on intimidation, she weaponized pity. Her crew's signature tactic, flying a distress flag with a woman's petticoat tied to the mast, lured victims into a false sense of chivalry. Survivors, the few who escaped, described how Rachel herself would weep on deck, begging rescuers for help, only to smirk as her men ambushed them. This performance wasn't just deception, it was satire, exposing how society's view of women as helpless made them the perfect predators. The guild's complicity ran deeper than profit. They actively sabotaged investigations, spreading rumors that Rachel's victims had perished in natural disasters. When a rare honest official tried to inspect a suspect cargo, guild lawyers drowned him in paperwork citing obscure salvage statutes. By the time authorities pieced together the pattern, Rachel had allegedly plundered a dozen ships, her crimes masked by the fishing industry's cries about hardship and unfair competition. Her downfall came from an uncharacteristic lapse in judgment. In 1789, she attempted a daylight robbery on a ship carrying a militia officer, whose testimony finally pierced the guild's web of lies. Even then, Boston's merchants rallied to her defense, portraying her as a victim of circumstance, a narrative that crumbled when investigators found her personal ledger detailing payoffs to guild stewards. Hanged that October, Rachel became both cautionary tale and folk hero, her legacy a stark reminder that in the newborn United States, piracy wasn't just a crime of the lawless. Sometimes it was collusion, hiding in plain sight behind respectable merchants counting their coins. Injela Gathonhelm didn't just inherit her husband's pirate fleet, she turned it into a shadow arm of the Swedish state. At the height of the Great Northern War in the early 1700s, while kings and generals clashed over Baltic dominance, Injela's ships prowled the coastline with a unique license to plunder enemy vessels under the tacit approval of Stockholm's iron merchants. This wasn't just piracy, it was economic warfare with Injela as its undisputed admiral. The alliance hinged on Sweden's most precious resource, iron. The kingdom's vast mines produced the finest ore in Europe, but wartime blockades by Russia and Denmark threatened to strangle exports. That's where Injela's fleet came in. Partnering with the powerful iron guilds of Vengeful and Uppsala, she orchestrated a daring smuggling network. Her ships would ambush Danish and Russian traders, seize their cargo holds, then replace the stolen goods with Swedish iron, now disguised as captured contraband, to bypass enemy inspections. By the time the stolen goods reached black markets in Amsterdam or London, the guilds had already pocketed the profits, while Injela took a cut hefty enough to fund even more raids. But the real genius of their scheme lay in its paperwork. Injela's husband, the legendary pirate Lars Gathonhelm, had secured privateering letters from King Charles XII before his death. Rather than let these documents gather dust, Injela used them as bargaining chips. She'd lease her legal piracy rights to iron merchants, allowing them to commission their own raids under her flag. Suddenly, respectable guildmasters found themselves running covert privateer operations, their ledgers filled with creative accounting entries like marine security services and naval procurement fees. The Swedish crown, desperate for war funds, conveniently ignored the arrangement, so long as Injela's gold kept flowing into their coffers. Injela's influence reached its peak during the Russian blockade of 1715. With Stockholm's ports frozen and trade at a standstill, she devised a brazen workaround. Her fleet began intercepting neutral Dutch ships, not to loot them but to broker deals. For a fee, Dutch captains would surrender their vessels to her crew, who'd then sail them into enemy waters flying Swedish colors. Once unloaded, the ships would escape back to neutral ports, their holds mysteriously empty. The iron guilds, meanwhile, celebrated record profits, their ore now reaching buyers through a maze of staged piracy and diplomatic theater. What set Injela apart was her mastery of plausible deniability. When Danish diplomats protested her raids, Swedish officials would produce her privateering papers with a shrug, claiming they couldn't control her excesses. Meanwhile, guild leaders hosted lavish dinners where toasts were made to patriotic entrepreneurs, wink wink, who kept Sweden's economy afloat. By war's end, Injela had not only amassed a fortune but reshaped Baltic trade itself, proving that in times of war, the most dangerous weapon isn't always a cannon. Sometimes, it's a ledger book and a well-timed wink between pirates and the men who mine the iron. Bonney's legend burns brightest in the shadows of Nassau's smuggler alleys, where the scent of salt and secrecy clung to every transaction. Unlike pirates who reveled in open defiance, Anne thrived in the gray zones, those carefully negotiated spaces where governors pretended not to see. Merchants kept double ledgers, and every handshake came with an unspoken price. Nassau wasn't just a pirate haven. It was a meticulously engineered shadow economy, and Anne's alliance with its smuggling syndicates turned her into something far more dangerous than a rogue with a cutlass. She became a linchpin. At first glance, the system seemed chaotic. Taverns overflowed with drunken sailors, stolen goods changed hands in broad daylight, and the British Navy's warnings were met with laughter. But beneath the surface, Nassau operated with the precision of a Swiss clock. Local merchants paid harbor fees to pirate captains like Anne in exchange for protection, not from her crew but from rival pirates. Meanwhile, colonial officials on nearby islands accepted regular bribes to lose paperwork, ensuring seized cargoes could be resold with clean titles. Anne's role, she was the enforcer who kept the gears turning. When a smuggler tried to cheat the system by underreporting a shipment of Spanish silks, it was Anne's crew that burned his warehouse as a reminder. When a greedy governor in Jamaica threatened to crack down, Anne's contacts leaked his own corruption records to his superiors. The real genius of Nassau's economy lay in its adaptability. Anne and her partners didn't just react to colonial laws, they anticipated them. Before the British could impose new tariffs on sugar, Nassau's smugglers had already rerouted shipments through a chain of shell merchants in Bermuda. When the Crown demanded inspections of all inbound textiles, Anne's fleet simply began labeling stolen fabrics as shipwreck salvage, complete with forged witness statements from paid-off fishermen. The system was so efficient that at its peak, historians estimate nearly a third of all goods entering the American colonies passed through Nassau's black market first. But Anne's most daring move was turning her infamy into insurance. Knowing that her name struck fear into honest captains, she offered merchants a macabre guarantee. Any ship carrying her signed pass would be spared by pirates for a fee, of course. Soon, vessels from Charleston to Havana flew scraps of cloth bearing her crude signature, a twisted parody of legitimate trade permits. The British Admiralty fumed, but even they couldn't deny the results. Ships with Anne's protection were statistically safer than those relying on royal navies. What made this alliance endure wasn't just greed, it was necessity. For the merchants of the Caribbean, piracy wasn't a disruption to trade, it was trade. Anne's network provided liquidity in an era when colonial currencies were scarce, her stolen Spanish silver becoming the de facto coin of the realm. Planters paid their workers with pieces of 8 from her raids, and churches rebuilt their altars with mahogany, liberated from Portuguese ships. By the time British forces finally occupied Nassau in 1718, they found a port so deeply entwined with piracy that their first act wasn't to hang the outlaws, it was to hire them as customs inspectors, proving that even empires could be pragmatic when profit was on the line. Anne's legacy, then, isn't just in the gold she stole, but in the uncomfortable truth she exposed, that the so-called golden age of piracy wasn't anarchy. It was just business conducted with a wink and a loaded pistol. Mary Read's cutlass wasn't her sharpest weapon, her understanding of corporate greed was. In 1718, as the Dutch East India Company tightened its stranglehold on the spice trade, this legendary pirate struck a deal that would make modern lobbyists blush. The VOC, the wealthiest corporation in history, faced a problem. British and French interlopers were undercutting their nutmeg and clove monopolies in the East Indies. Enter Mary and her crew, who began selectively targeting rival traders while mysteriously sparing Dutch ships. The arrangement wasn't charity, it was outsourcing. VOC merchants in Batavia would leak shipping schedules to Mary's network. Her fleet would intercept the competition, and suddenly Dutch warehouses overflowed with acquired goods at fire sale prices. The genius of this alliance lay in its deniability. VOC directors in Amsterdam could publicly condemn piracy while their colonial agents quietly funneled intelligence to Mary through coded messages hidden in innocuous cargo manifests. A barrel of salted fish marked with a particular knot might indicate a British pepper ship's route, while a crate of porcelain with a hairline crack could signal which French vessel carried untaxed silks. Mary, ever the pragmatist, played both sides when VOC payments lagged. She'd accidentally raid a Dutch ship just enough to remind them who controlled the waters. But the real twist, the VOC didn't just use Mary to attack rivals, they weaponized her reputation. After she captured a British merchantman laden with cinnamon, Dutch factors spread rumors that the captain had provoked her by cheating his crew. The story, likely fabricated, scared other traders into using VOC vessels for safe transport. Mary became the spectre haunting the spice lanes, her legend carefully curated by the very corporation that pretended to fear her. The partnership unraveled when a new VOC governor decided to make an example of piracy, conveniently after British pressure mounted. Mary was captured, tried, and sentenced to hang, though whispers persist that a certain Batavian merchant paid her jailer to look the other way during her escape. What makes this alliance unforgettable isn't its ruthlessness, but its revelation. When corporations grow powerful enough, they don't just break rules, they hire pirates to rewrite them. Jean de Belleville's war against the French crown began with salt, not gold, not jewels, but the humble white crystals that preserved fish and seasoned noble feasts. When King Philip VI executed her husband Olivier de Clisson in 1343 on trumped-up charges of treason, Jean didn't just mourn. She turned to the one resource Brittany had in abundance, its vast salt marshes, where the Breton Salt Syndicate held a near monopoly on this medieval necessity. To most, salt was a kitchen staple. To Jean, it became the currency of vengeance. The Syndicate, a tight-knit guild of marsh lords and traders, had long chafed under French taxation. Their salt routes, stretching from Guiran's pans to markets as far as Normandy, were already under threat from royal inspectors demanding ever higher tariffs. Jean offered them an alternative. Her fleet of 3 black-sailed ships, each named for a different saint, irony dripping like seawater from their bows, would escort their salt convoys past French patrols. In return, the Syndicate funneled her a percentage of every sale, disguising the payments as transport fees in their ledgers. What began as protection quickly evolved into something far bolder. Within months, Jean's raids took on a chilling precision. French tax ships vanished first, their crews found adrift in rowboats, their cargo holds emptied. Then the pattern shifted. Salt warehouses in loyalist towns mysteriously burned, while Breton merchants mysteriously had surplus stock to sell at inflated prices. The Syndicate's agents, meanwhile, spread whispers that the attacks were random acts of piracy. Never mind that Jean's crews somehow always knew which shipments belonged to royal allies and which to neutral traders. But the true stroke of genius was how Jean weaponized the salt itself. French forces garrisoned along the coast relied on Syndicate shipments for preserving their food. When Jean's network began selectively delaying deliveries to loyalist forts, soldiers found their meat rotting within days. Garrisons either turned a blind eye to her activities or faced starvation. The Syndicate, of course, blamed supply shortages, their representatives wringing their hands in faux despair as they counted their illicit profits. By 1346, the French crown saw the pattern. Tax revenues from Brittany's salt trade had plummeted, while Jean's attacks grew bolder. She even blockaded the Loire estuary for weeks, stranding royal wine shipments until the barrels burst. Desperate, Philip sent envoys to negotiate with the Syndicate, offering tax relief in exchange for abandoning Jean. They refused, not out of loyalty, but because her war had proven more profitable than peace. In the end, Salt did what swords could not. Jean's campaign, funded by those glittering crystals, forced the crown to the bargaining table. While she never fully avenged her husband, her syndicate-backed rebellion exposed the fragility of royal power. When basic commodities like salt, controlled by merchants and moved by pirates, could cripple a kingdom, it revealed a truth that terrified kings and empowered outlaws. In the medieval world, economics often trumped armies. Jean's story isn't just about vengeance. It's about how the most ordinary things in the right hands can become weapons. Lagertha's legend paints her as a warrior first, swords flashing, shield walls buckling under her command. But the sagas whisper another truth. Her greatest battles weren't fought on blood-soaked fields, but in the smoky trading halls of Hedeby, where amber and furs changed hands. While other Vikings raided monasteries for gold, Lagertha's fleet targeted something far more valuable: the trappers and traders who controlled the Arctic's fur trade. This wasn't mindless plunder, it was a hostile takeover with pelts as the currency of power. Picture the scene: a Norse trading post in the dead of winter, where merchants haggled over bundles of fox and beaver skins. These furs weren't just luxury goods, they were medieval gold, insulating European nobles from the cold and lining the coffers of Danish kings. Lagertha understood their worth better than most. Her longships would descend on rival fur convoys not to burn them, but to redirect them. Captured traders were given a choice: swear loyalty to her network or watch their livelihood sail away under her banner. Those who complied found themselves part of a sprawling operation where piracy and commerce blurred into one. The brilliance of her strategy lay in its simplicity. By controlling the supply chain at knife point, Lagertha could manipulate prices across the Baltic. A well-timed raid on a Swedish trapper's outpost would send fox pelts soaring in price at Hedeby's markets by spring. Meanwhile, her own protected traders, those who paid her tolls, could undercut competitors, their warehouses mysteriously untouched by the chaos. Even Danish tax collectors turned a blind eye, their palms greased with silver from Lagertha's cut. But the real masterstroke, her alliance with the Sami people, the indigenous reindeer herders of the far north. While other Vikings saw them as primitive, Lagertha recognized their expertise. Through a mix of intimidation and fair trade, she secured exclusive rights to their finest pelts: Arctic fox, snow hare, even the occasional polar bear hide. These rarities became her calling card, traded not for coin but for political favors. A cloak of white fox fur gifted to a Norwegian jarl might buy his silence when her ships passed through his waters. A bundle of beaver pelts delivered to a Frankish bishop could erase accusations of piracy with a well-timed sermon. What makes Lagertha's story so revealing is how it upends the Viking stereotype. The sagas love to paint Norse raiders as bloodthirsty berserkers, but her legacy proves many were savvy entrepreneurs in wolf skin cloaks. When she retired, legend says to a hall lined with furs, she left behind more than warrior tales. She'd created a blueprint for how piracy could evolve into monopoly, proving that sometimes the sharpest weapon wasn't an axe, but a well-timed trade embargo enforced by longships. The fur traders who came after her would use the same tactics, blurring lines between merchant and marauder until even kings couldn't tell the difference. Sadie Farrell's reign didn't unfold on the high seas or in some tropical pirate haven. It thrived in the grimy heart of 19th century New York, where the Hudson River's docks buzzed with stolen goods and whispered deals. Known as Sadie the Goat for her alleged habit of headbutting victims before robbing them, she was far more than a street thug. She was the linchpin of a sprawling river piracy network, and her most powerful allies weren't fellow outlaws, but the very dockworkers who loaded and unloaded the city's legitimate trade. In the shadow of America's Industrial Revolution, where steamships and railroads promised progress, Sadie and her collaborators exposed the rot beneath the gleaming surface of capitalism's rise. The dockworkers' role in this underworld wasn't incidental, it was systematic. These men, often exploited laborers themselves, knew every crate's contents, every shipment's schedule, and crucially, which merchants skimped on bribes to customs officials. Sadie's gang didn't waste time ambushing ships at random. They struck with surgical precision, targeting specific cargo holds because a dockhand had slipped them a manifest the night before. In return, the workers received a cut of the loot, or just as often, protection from rival gangs muscling in on their turf. It was a symbiotic relationship. The dockworkers provided intelligence and looked the other way during heists, while Sadie's crew enforced a brutal order on the waterfront, ensuring no independent thief disrupted their carefully orchestrated chaos. But the real innovation of this alliance was its laundering operation. Stolen goods didn't vanish into back alleys. They re-entered the legal market through a web of complicit merchants. A crate of stolen silk might be accidentally mislabeled at the dock, then sold at a discount to a fancy Broadway draper who asked no questions. Flour snatched from a barge could reappear in a Brooklyn bakery by dawn, its origins buried under layers of paperwork. Even the police, many of them on the take, played their part, focusing on petty crimes while Sadie's gang moved merchandise worth thousands. The system was so seamless that some stolen goods likely circled back to their original owners, resold to them by unscrupulous middlemen. What made Sadie's operation so audacious was its timing. This was the era of New York's explosive growth, where the city's elite were building brownstones and opera houses while immigrants crammed into tenements. The docks were the bottleneck through which all this wealth flowed, and Sadie, a working-class woman with no formal power, found a way to tap that stream. Her piracy wasn't just about theft, it was a grotesque parody of the Gilded Age's excesses. While robber barons like Vanderbilt and Astor monopolized industries through backroom deals, Sadie monopolized theft through her own brand of corporate espionage, her employees, from dockhands to corrupt cops, all taking their share. The alliance's downfall came from an unexpected source: progress. As the city modernized, replacing wooden piers with iron wharves and installing the first police telegraph systems, the old ways of doing business, both legal and illegal, were upended. Sadie's reign ended not with a dramatic battle, but with a whimper, as tighter security and corporate-owned docks squeezed out the small-time corruption she'd exploited. Yet her legacy lingers in the city's underworld lore, a reminder that piracy didn't just belong to the Caribbean or the medieval era. It flourished wherever greed and opportunity collided, even in the soot-stained streets of a rising superpower. The real twist: in a city built on backroom deals, Sadie the Goat might have been the most honest capitalist of them all. She just skipped the pretense of playing by the rules. Flora Byrne's story begins not with a ship's wheel in her hands, but with a ledger, one filled with deliberately smudged entries and coded entries for barrels of special tea. While American mobsters like Al Capone dominated Prohibition-era headlines across the Atlantic, Flora was orchestrating a different kind of rebellion. Scotland's whiskey trade, crippled by temperance laws and punitive taxes, faced an impossible choice: abandon centuries of distilling tradition or go underground. Flora chose the latter, forging an alliance with Highland distillers that turned the frigid waters of the North Sea into a liquor highway. This wasn't piracy as the Golden Age had known it: no cutlasses, no Jolly Roger. But the principles were the same: defy authority, control supply chains, and profit from desperation. The mechanics of their operation were deceptively simple. Legal distilleries, strangled by government inspectors and paperwork, began producing ghost batches whiskey made off the books with no taxes paid. Flora's fleet of repurposed fishing trawlers, their hulls modified with hidden compartments, would collect these barrels under cover of darkness. But here's where the scheme got clever. Instead of smuggling the whiskey directly to buyers, she played the long game. Her ships would rendezvous with Danish and Dutch fishing crews in international waters, trading whiskey for herring or tobacco. These neutral traders then legally imported the goods back to Europe, where Flora's contacts relabeled the barrels as medicinal spirits or industrial alcohol before funneling them into legitimate markets. By the time the whiskey reached speakeasies in Glasgow or London, it had passed through so many hands that authorities couldn't trace its origins. What set Flora apart was her understanding of psychology. While American bootleggers relied on violence, she weaponized Scottish pride. When temperance activists raided a warehouse in Edinburgh, they found crates stamped with a thistle and the Gaelic phrase, "Slaint em hath, good health." The message was clear: drinking wasn't a crime, it was cultural preservation. Flora's alliance with distillers leaned into this narrative, painting themselves as defenders of tradition against meddling bureaucrats. Even local clergy who publicly denounced drinking privately bought Flora's sacramental whiskey for communion, a hypocrisy that secured her protection in tight-knit communities. The real brilliance of her network, its adaptability. When British patrols increased surveillance near major ports, Flora shifted tactics. Distillers began aging their whiskey in remote sea caves, where Flora's crew could load it directly onto small boats at high tide. Others buried barrels beneath peat bogs, their locations marked on maps smuggled inside hymn books. At its peak, her operation was so sophisticated that some legal distilleries secretly paid her to steal their own overstock, a handy way to explain missing inventory to taxmen while recouping losses on the black market. Flora's legacy isn't just in the whiskey she smuggled, but in the precedent she set. Her alliance proved that piracy isn't bound by eras or geography, it evolves with the times. When governments cracked down on one vice, entrepreneurs like Flora found another. And though Prohibition eventually ended, the shadow economy she helped build never fully disappeared. To this day, Scotland's backroads hide unmarked stills, their operators winking as they pour a dram of the water of life, a proof that some alliances, once forged in secrecy, outlast even the laws that created them. Lai Choi San's fleet didn't just sail the South China Sea, they ruled it, their black-sailed junks gliding through the mist like ghosts. Known as the Opium Queen, she commanded a smuggling empire so vast that British colonial officials pretended not to see it, while Chinese merchants whispered her name in backroom deals. But here's the twist: her power didn't come from terror alone. It came from an unspoken pact with the very guilds that publicly denounced her, a collaboration that exposed how addiction and empire were two sides of the same tarnished coin. Opium was the lifeblood of colonial Hong Kong, a commodity so lucrative that governments and merchants alike turned blind eyes to its horrors. British traders shipped it from India, Chinese middlemen distributed it, and addicts paid with their lives. Lai Choi San spotted the gap in this chain, the moment between shipment and sale, where cargo was vulnerable. Her pirates began intercepting opium clippers, not to destroy the shipments but to hijack them. Then came the offer: pay her a protection fee, and your cargo would reach its destination unharmed. Refuse, and your ships vanished into the fog. The merchant guilds, caught between colonial taxes and Lai Choi San's demands, made a cold calculation. It was cheaper to work with her than against her. They funneled her intelligence customs patrol schedules, rival smugglers' routes, even the names of corrupt officials willing to look the other way. In return, her fleet became their shadow enforcers, ensuring only guild-affiliated opium made it to market. The system was brutally efficient. Addicts didn't care whose hands fed their habit, so long as the pipe was full. And the guilds, they simply raised prices to cover Lai Choi San's cut, passing the cost to those already paying with their health. But the real darkness of this alliance lay in its hypocrisy. The same guilds that donated to temples and funded schools also bankrolled Lai Choi San's raids, their ledgers meticulously balanced between charity and blood money. When British authorities staged anti-piracy crackdowns, guild elders would publicly cheer, then leak the raid plans to her network hours in advance. Even colonial officers played both sides, accepting bribes to lose evidence while posing for photographs with confiscated opium chests they'd never actually seized. Lai Choi San's reign peaked in the 1930s when she controlled nearly a third of the region's opium flow. Her ships flew no flags, but everyone knew the rules. A junk with a red lantern hanging from its mast was under her protection. Those without risked everything. The guilds, meanwhile, laundered her plunder through shell companies, their warehouses stocked with legal opium-bearing forged tax stamps. It was a circular economy of exploitation where the victims were countless addicts in smoky dens, and the winners were pirates and merchants counting their silver. What makes this alliance unforgettable isn't its cruelty, but its naked pragmatism. In the end, Lai Choi San wasn't a rebel or a revolutionary. She was a profiteer in a system built on exploitation. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Piracy thrives where empires and commerce intersect, and sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones with cutlasses, but the ones with ledger books and clean hands. The Opium Queen didn't corrupt the trade. She simply exposed how corrupt it already was. Maria Cobham's ships didn't dock in shadowy coves or hidden inlets. They pulled right up to the bustling wharves of Cornwall's tin ports, their holds filled with contraband disguised as lumpy sacks of ore. While other pirates relied on secrecy, Maria's genius lay in plain sight. Tin mining wasn't just Cornwall's lifeblood. It was the perfect cover for smuggling, and the miners, exploited, underpaid, and ignored by distant London bureaucrats, were eager collaborators. What began as a few discreet favors soon became a full-blown shadow economy, where stolen silk could vanish into a shipment of raw tin as easily as a drop of rain into the sea. The system worked because tin was messy business. From the moment it was hacked from the earth to its final sale, the ore passed through countless hands, miners hauling it from damp tunnels, carters transporting it to coastal smelters, merchants weighing and grading it for export. At any point, a few extra sacks could appear or disappear without raising eyebrows. Maria's crew exploited these gaps with precision. A cart might leave a mine with 20 sacks but arrive at the dock with 22, the extras stuffed with lace or tobacco from her latest raid. Smelters, many of them indebted to local smugglers for loans, turned blind eyes to odd lumps in the ore. Even customs inspectors played along, some bribed with silver, others intimidated by the miners' tight-knit loyalty. After all, in villages where every family depended on tin, no one asked why certain shipments always sailed with Maria's flag flying overhead. But the real stroke of brilliance was how Maria weaponized Cornwall's geography. The region's tin ports were natural fortresses, their narrow channels flanked by cliffs that hid approaching ships until the last moment. Miners doubling as lookouts would signal with lanterns 2 flashes for a safe arrival, 3 for danger. When revenue cutters patrolled, Maria's cargo could be dumped into abandoned mine shafts within minutes, the entrances disguised with false rock piles. By the time inspectors finished rifling through empty sacks, the stolen goods were already underground, waiting to resurface as newly mined tin weeks later. The miners' loyalty wasn't just bought, it was earned. Maria plowed a share of her profits back into their communities, funding everything from chapel repairs to funeral expenses for men killed in tunnel collapses. When a harsh winter left families starving after the Crown seized a tin shipment for back taxes, her ships appeared with holds full of stolen grain, gifted to the hungry. This reciprocity transformed her from a criminal into a folk hero. Ballads painted her as a Robin Hood of the coasts, though the truth was more pragmatic. Happy miners asked fewer questions, and grateful villages didn't betray their benefactors. The Alliance's downfall came from an unexpected source: progress. As steam engines replaced hand labor in the mines, centralized companies bought out small operations, bringing stricter accounting and outsider overseers. The old flexibility vanished under ledgers checked by London accountants. Maria, ever adaptable, shifted operations to the fishing trade, but the golden age of tin smuggling piracy was over. Yet its legacy lingers in Cornwall's folklore and in the crumbling mine shafts that still whisper of a time when pirates and miners alike answered to a different law, one written not in Parliament, but in shared survival and the silent understanding that sometimes the best place to hide treasure isn't on a deserted island, but in plain sight, covered in the honest grime of an honest man's labor. Elissa of Carthage, better known as Dido in Virgil's tales, wasn't just a legendary queen. She was antiquity's first pirate queen, and her partnership with the Phoenician glass guilds laid the groundwork for every medieval alliance that followed. Centuries before Grace O'Malley or Ching, Elissa understood that piracy wasn't just about raiding, it was about controlling supply chains. The Phoenicians, masters of Mediterranean trade, had a problem. Their prized glass, vibrant, translucent, and worth its weight in silver, was being hijacked by rival traders and opportunistic raiders. Elissa offered a solution. Her fleet wouldn't just protect Phoenician ships, they'd become the distributors, ensuring glass reached markets from Tyre to Tartessos without interference, for a hefty percentage, of course. The brilliance of this arrangement lay in its subtlety. Elissa's pirates didn't just guard cargo, they manipulated the market by selectively targeting rival glass shipments while letting Phoenician goods pass unscathed. She artificially inflated demand. A well-timed raid on an Egyptian trader's vessel could send prices soaring in Cyprus by the next moon, with Phoenician merchants suddenly the only suppliers left standing. The guilds, meanwhile, laundered her plunder through their existing networks, melting down stolen glass to rebrand it as their own. Archaeologists still debate whether certain Phoenician glass beads found in Sardinia were genuine or recycled loot from Elissa's raids. But Elissa's real legacy was her political maneuvering. When she fled Tyre after her brother murdered her husband, she didn't arrive in North Africa as a beggar. She came as a pirate queen with a fleet and a trade network. The founding myth of Carthage, where she bargained for land by promising to take only what could be covered by a bull's hide, then cutting it into strips to claim a hilltop, mirrors her economic strategy, exploiting loopholes others didn't see. The glass guilds, eager to break free of Tyrian control, financed her settlement, ensuring Carthage became a hub for their goods and a thorn in Tyre's side. What connects Elissa to the medieval pirate queens is her understanding of legitimacy. She didn't just want wealth, she needed infrastructure. By partnering with the guilds, she transformed her pirates from outlaws into a private navy, their raids reframed as tax collection or trade enforcement. When Virgil painted her as a lovelorn queen, he erased her sharper edges, the negotiator who used piracy to build an empire, the woman who proved that even in the ancient world, the most enduring kingdoms were forged not just by swords, but by secret handshakes with those who controlled the glass, the gold, and the gates of trade. Her story whispers across the centuries to the medieval pirate queens who would follow. Power isn't taken from thrones alone. Sometimes it's bargained for in the back rooms of guild halls, where the clink of glass and gold sounds louder than the clash of steel. Laskarina Babulina didn't just command a fleet, she built one, plank by plank, in the shadow of an Ottoman empire that never saw her coming. While other pirate queens used their ships to chase treasure, Babulina turned hers into instruments of revolution, thanks to an alliance as strategic as it was unlikely: the clandestine network of Greek shipbuilders who risked everything to fuel her war for independence. This wasn't just piracy for profit, it was piracy with a purpose, where every stolen Ottoman cargo and every smuggled cannon brought Greece one step closer to freedom. The shipbuilders of Spetses and Hydra, islands long known for their maritime prowess, faced an impossible choice under Ottoman rule. They could craft vessels for their occupiers, watching their work be used to enforce tyranny, or they could secretly funnel their skills to rebels like Babulina. They chose defiance. By day, their yards produced innocuous merchant ships. By night, the same hands transformed them into warships, reinforcing hulls for combat and carving hidden compartments for weapons. Babulina, a widow who'd inherited her husband's fortune and his thirst for justice, financed this double life, her goal buying not just loyalty but innovation. The result, a fleet that looked like traders until the moment their decks sprouted cannons, their crews striking with the element of surprise. But the real genius of this alliance lay in its logistics. Ottoman law forbade Greeks from owning large ships, so Babulina and the shipbuilders crafted a workaround. She sold her vessels to trusted captains, men already sworn to the revolution, while retaining de facto control. The shipyards, meanwhile, kept two sets of ledgers, one for prying Ottoman inspectors, another tracking which merchant ships were actually warships in disguise. When Babulina's flagship, the Agamemnon, launched in 1821, it was a masterpiece of this deception, outwardly a trading vessel, inwardly a floating fortress with 18 guns and a hold packed with gunpowder smuggled past Ottoman docks in sacks of grain. The political dimension of this partnership set it apart from other pirate alliances. Babulina didn't just share plunder with her shipbuilders, she shared a cause. Every ship they built together wasn't just a tool for raiding, it was a symbol of resistance, proof that Greek ingenuity could outmaneuver Ottoman oppression. The shipyards became recruiting grounds, with apprentices signing secret oaths to the Philiki-Ateria, the underground revolutionary society. When Babulina's fleet blockaded Ottoman-held ports, it wasn't just to starve the enemy, it was to send a message to the world that Greece could fight back. What makes this alliance extraordinary is how it blurred the lines between piracy and patriotism. Babulina's raids on Ottoman ships weren't condemned as crimes by the Greek people. They were celebrated as acts of liberation, her crews hailed as heroes. The shipbuilders, though their names are often forgotten, were just as vital. Without their risk and craftsmanship, the revolution might have died at sea. Together, they proved that piracy, when wielded with purpose, could be more than a means to wealth. It could be the spark that lights a nation's fire. In the end, Babulina's story isn't just about a pirate queen. It's about how empires aren't toppled by swords alone, but by the unsung hands that forge the weapons, and the alliances that turn rebels into legends. When she fell in battle, her death galvanized Greece further, proof that even the mightiest oppressors could be challenged by those who dared to build and sail toward freedom. From the icy waters of the Baltic to the bustling ports of the Caribbean, These 22 alliances prove piracy was never just about stolen gold or reckless rebellion. It was a calculated dance of power where pirate queens and merchant guilds moved in lockstep to reshape the world. Think about it, while kings waged wars for land and glory, these women were playing a different game entirely. They didn't just break the rules, they rewrote them in ledgers and treaties, proving that sometimes the mightiest empires could be toppled not by armies, but by a well-timed handshake between those who controlled the seas and those who counted the coin. What makes these partnerships so revolutionary isn't just their audacity, it's their legacy. The ripple effects of these alliances still echo today, modern tax havens. They're the spiritual descendants of pirate-friendly ports like Nassau, where stolen wealth once slipped into the legal economy, corporate monopolies. They're not so different from the guilds that paid pirates to sink their competitors. Even the concept of too big to fail has roots in these stories, like when the Hanseatic League realized it was cheaper to bribe Baltic raiders than to fight them. The pirate queens and their merchant partners weren't just outliers, they were pioneers of a shadow economy that still thrives in the margins. But here's the twist, these women didn't just exploit systems, they exposed them. Every time a pirate queen like Grace O'Malley sat across from a queen or a guildmaster as an equal, she revealed the hypocrisy of empires that preached law and order while profiting from chaos. When Ching turned piracy into a regulated industry, she proved that legitimacy wasn't about morality. It was about who held the leverage. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths, that piracy wasn't the opposite of commerce, but its dark twin, and that the line between hero and outlaw often depends on who's writing the history books. So what's the takeaway? History isn't just the tale of kings and battles, it's also the story of deals struck in candlelit back rooms, of alliances forged between people the world underestimated. The next time you hear about a pirate queen, remember, her real weapon wasn't the sword in her hand, but the network she built. And if this deep dive into history's hidden corridors has you hungry for more, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us which alliance left you stunned. Was it the sugar barons who bankrolled Jacot de la Haye, or the tin miners who smuggled fortunes under Maria Cobham's nose? Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told. After all, as these pirate queens showed us, the most powerful truths are often the ones they tried to erase.